Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 167 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are joined once again by friend of the podcast, Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University right here in St. Paul. Jerrod's also with the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. We are going to continue our series on profiling and providing case studies of infamous serial killers by taking a look at the case of Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker. Now, please know that Dr. Brown and I are not using these cases to glamorize the individual or do this for any type of shock value, but rather to use these cases to illustrate these crimes and behaviors as a case study for you all to learn from. Dr. Brown nor I are suggesting that any of you will likely ever supervise a serial killer, but you may supervise or interact with populations who may exhibit some of the same precursors. We like to talk on this show about pathways into crime and pathways out of crime and into desistance. So one of the reasons we do these profiles is to highlight some of those common denominator pathways that you may see in your high-risk clients. We're also going to take another look at the exciting emerging field of neurocriminology. In fact, please listen for some exciting updates as to an opportunity for you and or your agency to become a Neurocriminology Informed Professional, thanks to our good friends at the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. I'm super excited to share this news with you all, so please listen for that during the interview and at the conclusion of my conversation with Dr. Brown. If you are newer to the podcast, I encourage you to go back and check out all of Dr. Brown's previous appearances on the Criminologist podcast. Jerrod Brown, PhD, is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jerrod is currently an assistant professor, program director, and lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health and a second emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies for Concordia University, right here in St. Paul, Minnesota. Jerrod's a friend of the show, so I suspect many of you are aware of his background by now, so I will allow him to provide any additional introductory information on his own. Please enjoy my interview with Dr. Jerrod Brown and his profile of Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome back to the program, Jerrod. So good to be talking to you again. I was reflecting this morning about the state of corrections and about all of the awesome things that we are doing to move the needle on results because of the great work that you do and that a lot of the guests that I have on the show do to promote core correctional skills, evidence-based practices. Despite that, though, I got a little bit sad thinking about the current state, particularly if you look at it through a statistical lens, which we have to rely on the data. But as many or not folks know, we still have some really horrendous rates of recidivism, failure rates, folks released from prison, returning to the institution, the majority of them, maybe close to 80% of them within a few years of release. And I was thinking about if those results were evident in other vocations, it just wouldn't be acceptable. For example, if you gave your investments to a financial advisor and he said, well, I'm probably going to lose 80% of this money, you'd find a new financial advisor. Or
excellent analogy.
Yeah. Or if you took your, you took your car to the mechanic and he said, yeah, this fix is probably going to work 20% of the time. Or even if, one of your kids' school teachers, for you listeners out there, 80% of the students were being held back. But we sort of turned a blind eye to that, and the teacher just kept on teaching, and teacher got even promoted, and we just accepted this status quo, which, full circle, is why I love having you on the show, Jerrod, because you introduce the audience to a larger world out there, sort of increase their lens of what they can look at working with their clientele. That's been a theme of this podcast, as regular listeners know. I'm always preaching the value of we have to broaden that lens. We have to view our clients much more holistically. We have done great work embracing Dr. Banta's Risk-Need-Responsivity framework over the last 40, 50 years. And that's gotten us great results, but we sort of have to level up now and start looking at, among other things, the emerging desistance literature, or your area of expertise, one of many of your areas of expertise, neurocriminology. We need to start looking at those physiological reasons as well to get, again, a bigger picture, a wider lens of why folks reoffend and how we can get them on the right pathway to desist from crime.
Excellent analogies. Yeah, it makes me just stop and pause and like, holy cow, that is very true. Yeah, I would not probably go to a college where there'd be 80% likelihood that I might not be successful. So something to think about. You mentioned neurocriminology and physiological components. That's only a sliver of neurocriminology research. So if you have never heard me talk about the field of neurocriminology, this is just my opinion and where I'm at today. I truly believe whatever field of study you're in, if you can learn more about neurocriminology research, you're going to be in a better position to understand complex human behavior at a deeper level. That could be working with very violent offenders. It could be working with substance use offenders, people who engage in domestic violence or child abuse, fire setting, whatever kind of offender it is, if it's a high risk, a medium, or low. If you learn about this field of study, I think it's only going to enhance your understanding of why it's not only important to obviously consider the family factors, the social factors, the environmental factors. Those are all very, very important. I'm not saying stop doing that. But if you were to start infusing neurocriminology research into the work you do, it gives you a much deeper, better picture of why people may engage in problematic behavior. So neurocriminology is a sub-discipline of criminology. One of my master's degrees is in criminal justice. We didn't really talk much about any of this stuff in my master's degree in criminal justice. Most programs, in my opinion, don't really talk about this too much. But if you were start to infuse neurocriminology research into what you do, you're learning about neuroscience, so brain-based research. You're starting to understand that genetics does play a role in some cases. We need to be aware of like genetics, biochemistry, so biochemical abnormalities that could be going on in the body. Being aware of physiological dysregulation, Joe mentioned, that could be issues of like heart rate variability and skin conductive levels. These are just really interesting things. And we want to really take into account prenatal factors as well, not just what happened to your client after birth, but there's a strong argument to be made. Unfortunately, criminality in some cases has a foundation in utero. And we'll talk about that with the case we're examining today as well. When you start becoming neurocriminology informed, you want to start understanding the brains of people that do difficult, terrible, antisocial, problematic, concerning behaviors. So we'd want to understand brain structure, brain functioning. But neurocriminology literature is not just understanding the brains of criminals too, but it's also, it can help us diagnose the causes of crime and criminal behavior. So looking at it through a neurological, biological, psychological, and social lens. So if we start looking at like some of the different kinds of topics that are talked about in the world of neurocriminology, understanding hormones. Why in the world do we want to care about hormones? Because hormonal dysregulation can impact the entire body and brain. We want to be aware of nutrition. You will find multiple studies that talk about poor nutrition, malnutrition, food insecurity, excessive sugar consumption, excessive caffeine consumption. The list goes on. And the case we're talking about today, I'm going to talk just a little bit about that. Head injuries, have to understand head injuries because there's a high likelihood half your clients you work with have a history of head injuries. People in prison, the research, if you believe it, half people or more within confinement settings have a head injury history. And the research points to the fact if you work with female offender populations, that number's higher. And the more violent offending populations you work with, the likelihood of head injury history is even higher. On top of that, almost everyone in prison has had trauma in their lifetime. So we need to be trauma informed, which is very, very important. And going a little bit deeper, if we looked at this through this neurocriminological lens, food sensitivities and chemical sensitivities and environmental contaminants need to be considered. Air pollution exposure. What happens if you work with a client growing up, they're a child, they lived in poverty or homelessness, and they're exposed to a bunch of lead or mercury, or they lived right across the street from a factory or a busy freeway. The case we're examining today, that topic will be talked about. And on top of that, if we go deeper in the weeds, we need to be aware too, not just what happened during pregnancy, but what happened during the birthing process. This research talks about pregnancy complications as well, birth defects, being born prematurely. By no means am I saying someone's born prematurely, they're going to grow up and commit criminal behavior, but it is talked about in this literature as a variable to take into account. We also need to be aware in some cases, if you really want to dig in the weeds with this, look at some of the literature on low cholesterol levels. Just if you got a few minutes after you listen to this, type in low cholesterol levels and criminal behavior. Really fascinating. Or low arousal levels, or low cortisol levels, or low serotonin levels. This is really fascinating stuff. And part of what I do too, I really try to weave in research, not just from neurocriminology, but from forensic psychology and forensic neuroscience as well. I'm actually in the process of wrapping up a graduate certificate right now that I'm taking myself as a student online through the Michigan State University in neuroscience and the law. So in that program, I've really had even a deeper appreciation for the nervous system, the HPA axis. So if you want to become neurocriminology informed, learn about the nervous system, learn about the HPA axis as well, the hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. And one other thing that I'll say before we jump into our case study today is I encourage all of you to become gut brain health informed. I am doing more and more work in that all the time. I'm doing more podcasts, more trainings on that. Why should you care about the gut digestive health issues? Well, that topic's been studied thousands of times over within the context of all kinds of topics. There are articles and studies now being published that talk about it within the context of problematic behavior in the criminal justice system. Not a lot yet, but in my experience, consulting with different groups around the country, when it pertains to really difficult cases, the overwhelming majority of these clients seem to have digestive health issues. And if your gut is off, just understand that your gut is the hub of immunity in your body. It's part of our endocrine system, and it produces way more serotonin is produced in our gut than our brain. Just look at serotonin if you really want to be convinced why you need to understand digestive health issues. And not to knock any prison systems around the country, but if you look at the research in general, when people go to prison, they don't have access to that good of healthy food. Look at the role that nutrition plays in the gut, the role that stress plays, the role that mental health plays, the role that drugs and alcohol play, and the list goes on. So becoming digestive health informed, gut brain health informed, very, very important. So before I jump into Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, Joe, do you have any thoughts on anything I just said?
Lots of thoughts, as always, Jerrod. I loved earlier when you were speaking, you used that term, sort of pose the question to the audience. If you're supervising or interacting with individuals who have complex human behavior, and I think that's the way in corrections, for example, we need to begin expanding our view of our clientele. I noted, again, we've done a good job over the last 40, 50 years of building on the Risk-Need-Responsivity framework, which is focusing on those criminogenic factors, those drivers of crime. But as you just alluded to so eloquently, those justice-involved individuals are exhibiting complex human behavior, not simply criminal behavior. And I think we need to, again, expand that lens a little bit through everything you just talked about, up to and including one of my favorite topics that you turned me on to as I'm enrolled in your trauma certificate, the HPA access. I can't imagine talking to probation officers in the future if we say and think, remember back in the day when POs didn't know anything about HPA access, or you could retire from a prison, working in a prison rather, not knowing that over half the prisoners suffer head injury. Again, I think we just need to keep on learning and pushing ourselves. We owe it to our clients, we owe it to our stakeholders, we owe it to the community. And so let's do that via the case of Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker.
You bet. Well, we have profiled a number of different serial killers over the last year or so or more. And again, Joe and I always say we're not trying to sensationalize the topic. We're taking some of the most extreme examples and cases and really dissecting the histories of these individuals, breaking it down, tying it to what the research literature says today, and hopefully providing all of you just with some practical tips, takeaway points that just to be aware of, to use with your clients. Again, almost none of us will work with a person like Richard Ramirez, but we may work with many people that have had similar things happen in their history, but maybe they never grew up to be a serial killer. But what I will say, out of all the serial killers we profiled to date, this will be the case to really understand what are the factors involved in why someone may actually grow up to become a serial killer. I can't think of a better case I've profiled to date where it has all the underpinnings that are talked about in the serial killer literature. So if you're not familiar with the Night Stalker case, he's one of the most sadistic serial killers in American history. He was referred to as a psychotic murderer. He was a Satan worshiper. Even at his trial, he referred to himself as Satan's right-hand man. So take that into account when we talk about him. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the Night Stalker. That was the name given to him. But prior to that, he had a name of the Valley Intruder, as well as the Walk-In Killer. These are some names given to him in the popular media at that time where they didn't know, obviously, who he was. He was born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas. Parents raised him. We'll talk about his family factors. Obviously, he was the youngest of 5 children. So we want to take that into account. He committed a number of different offenses before engaging in homicidal behavior. So we'll talk about some of those factors as well today. But we want to be aware some of the factors at his trial that were talked about, and he was actually convicted of 43 different charges, a number of burglary counts, 13 counts of murder, several accounts of sexual assault, multiple accounts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to the death penalty. He did die in prison several years ago before he actually was executed, but he died of natural causes. And his crime history involved, obviously, homicide, sexual assaults, attempted rape, burglary, and a number of other things early on in life. This is an interesting case because of the fact the profile of his victims was all over the map. So a lot of serial killers may target a specific group of people, prostitutes, sometimes young kids, maybe it's women. He targeted really anyone. His mode of operation a lot of times was breaking into the homes of individuals. And his method of killing, we've talked about methods of killing in some of our other cases too. A lot of serial killers have a similar method, not always, but his method of killing was all over the map. He would beat his victims to death. He would tie his victims up. He would torture them. He would shoot some of them. He would strangle. He would stomp some of them to death. It was really all over the map. We're not going to get deep in the weeds in terms of what happened at the crime scenes, but in some of the crimes, he used a machete, a tire iron, a claw hammer. He pistol whipped some of his victims. He strangled them. It's really a very deviant case. So if we start looking at his early history, really, really interesting stuff. So if we start with the prenatal world, so remember we just talked about in the neurocriminology segment before we started with the case, what was going on prenatally? A lot of the profiles that we've done, Joe and I have done, we don't know a lot about prenatal history. With him, we know a little bit. This is where it gets a little interesting. Where he lived, where his mom and dad lived, early on, this was an area where his parents were exposed to nuclear radiation because the U.S. government was doing nuclear bomb tests near where they lived. So at that time, it wasn't really highly publicized, but by all accounts, his parents were exposed to some form of nuclear radiation. And why does that play into account? Because all of his siblings, at least from the information I know, were born with some level of birth defects. And another interesting thing that people are surprised to learn about, or the birth defects were respiratory in nature, and they had some bone deformities that were known. Richard did have some problems in school too, so I wonder what was going on with brain functioning, learning, cognition, executive function. And another interesting fact that people are surprised to hear about is that when his mom was pregnant with Richard, she worked in a factory where she was exposed to a number of chemical fumes. So there's some indication that also contributed to some problematic outcomes for Richard. So he was exposed in utero to chemical fumes, environmental toxins, which if you want to study that deeper, I would recommend Googling endocrine disruptors. Just take a look at that. Really fascinating and disturbing things. And if we look at the general literature on the factors that can positively or negatively impact fetal development, nutritional factors, what kind of trauma was going on in utero, we need to be aware of genetic factors, substance use factors, environmental toxins. Was mom on any medications? Was mom dealing with any kinds of diseases or infections during pregnancy? A lot of this we don't know with his mom, but those are some of the factors that can impact fetal development. And if we look at the general literature on prenatal exposure to different kinds of toxins or environmental contaminants, it has been linked to causing more medical issues. So low birth weight in some cases, movement problems as that child gets older, learning, attention, memory problems. Some kids exposed to toxins in utero may have higher levels of hyperactivity, impulse control problems, irritability, academic issues as they get older. So that's more in the general research, but hopefully that just gives us an indication of why we need to care about what happens in utero as well. Even if you're working with an adult, we need to be aware of what happened to that adult several decades prior in utero, because that experience in utero can carry on throughout the entire lifespan. Before I move on from the prenatal stuff, Joe, any thoughts?
No, I'm always fascinated, as you know, by the early influences, those precursors. You did a great job of making it clear that we're not suggesting you may actually, any of you, supervise a serial killer, but we're simply trying to point out some of those precursors, common denominators that may be shared with some of the high-risk individuals that you supervise, to get it on your radar and get you thinking about appropriate intervention. So I'm loving this, Jerrod.
Thank you, Joe. So as we move away from the prenatal world, now let's move into early childhood with Richard Ramirez. His father, in the articles, the literature, the documentaries you'll find on the Night Stalker, they referred to his father as a violent alcoholic. When he was born early on in life, by all accounts, he lived in a poverty-stricken area. So looking at some of the literature on poverty, I think is very important. And as he got a little bit older, he started to associate with his, I believe, cousin. And his cousin's name was Mike. And why do we want to care about that? Because his cousin was a Vietnam veteran. And when he returned from Vietnam, he came back with numerous photos of just horrific things that he did to people over in Vietnam, and actually exposed Richard Ramirez to these photos early on in life. I believe at that time, Richard Ramirez was around 12 years of age when he really started to become closer to this older cousin. So why do we care about that? Because the older cousin, again, was starting to model very sadistic and violent thoughts and thinking patterns, and then showing him these photos. By all accounts, Richard started to be really amazed by these horrific photos and started to infuse sexual fantasy with all of these things he was seeing. At the age of 13, Richard was by all accounts, at his cousin's home, and his cousin Mike, at the time, had a wife. They got into an argument, and the cousin murdered the wife in front of Richard. So now, not just prior to that, Richard saw these photos and heard all of these stories, but he actually saw this firsthand experience of his cousin Mike murdering his wife. So we have a lot of exposure to horrific traumas. So a lot of things to take into account. As he got a little bit older, he started to view extreme pornography. He had a lot of sexual fantasies about like forced bondage, mutilation, rape, murder. And what we know from some of the serial killers we profiled, these deviant behaviors they engaged in did not happen overnight. Most of the time, they usually start years and years prior, where they're having these fantasies. And these fantasies grow and grow and grow. And eventually there's a triggering event where the fantasy turns into reality and they actually carry out these very deviant behaviors. So a lot of things to take into account prenatally and early childhood. The question comes up too, what about his diagnostic history, mental health history? If you were to dig into like all the articles and things of that nature and the documentaries that have been talked about him, ADHD's been brought up, that he was diagnosed with ADHD at one point. Schizoid personality disorder has been noted. He actually had 2 separate head injuries early on in life, and one of the head injuries resulted in seizures. So now we have at least 2 documented cases of head trauma. He, by all accounts, was diagnosed or met diagnostic criteria for conduct disorder. He had narcissistic traits. He had psychopathic traits. He had sadistic traits. He had a very long history of drug and alcohol problems. So we have a lot of moving parts going on. And again, by no means am I saying if you work with a child or a teenager who has conduct disorder, the overwhelming majority of those kids will never come anywhere close to what Richard Ramirez did. But again, we want to be aware if you're working with a youth who has conduct disorder, early intervention is key. Kids with conduct disorder in general are going to have more behavioral problems, higher levels of aggression, bullying, property destruction, higher incidence of drug and alcohol problems, disruptive behavioral patterns, things of that nature. On the extreme end, if any of you work with individuals that might meet diagnostic criteria for conduct disorder, but they seem to be even more callous, be aware of the topic of callous and unemotional traits. I would highly recommend just being aware of that. That's really an extreme example of something we need to intervene with immediately. People with callous and unemotional traits might be more likely to try to blackmail other people, violent intimidation. It's been linked to higher levels of aggressiveness, higher levels of peer rejection too. So obviously if a kid has callous and unemotional traits, it might be very difficult for that individual to connect with other kids in school. So, Joe, I'm going to park the brakes and just see what you think. Any thoughts from your lens as well?
I'm loving the profile you're providing here, even of a young Richard Ramirez. And to my earlier point I've been making about the value added of broadening our lens. So, for example, when you were talking about when he was 12 years old and he witnessed the murdering of his cousin's wife. So I could just look at that right there, Jerrod, through my risk-need-responsivity lens. I train on a variety of R&R based risk assessments, and I could look at those boxes being checked through that social learning theory lens. You even said violence was modeled. So I could look at this through that lens and say, yeah, he's checking all the boxes. I could also look at this. You mentioned trauma. I could look at this through the ACEs lens. ACEs, of course, standing for adverse childhood experiences, and say, yeah, he's hitting all the trauma boxes. And you just did it with conduct disorder. My point here being, we don't have to be so almost partisan and exclusionary of other information. None of these are in contradiction, I would contend. It really just behooves the practitioner to at least be aware of these other precursors and that other information, and don't look at it as an either or, but an all of the above.
Excellent points, Joe. And what do you think about this? So the modeling behavior is so important. I mean, who we associate with, but he idolized his older cousin. How might that play into this? If, let's say, you idolize the person who's done these horrific things, or you're just around someone that you might not like, but they're modeling that behavior.
Excellent question, Jerrod. I could get really in the weeds. It's even mentioned in The Psychology of Criminal Conduct by Bont and Andrews, from which we derive a variety of principles, up to and including the principles of risk, need, and responsivity. But if you have a copy of the 6th edition, you could look this up. They actually address this. And to your point, it's not simply witnessing or that behavior being modeled, but they examine the connection that the individual has with the person doing the modeling. So if they look at that individual in a favorable light, as you just pointed out, almost idolizing them, it really intensifies the impact of that modeled behavior. Whereas if they are more agnostic towards that person, it minimizes it. And then the flip side of that modeling coin is, of course, if the modeling behavior is pro-social or antisocial. So again, to your point, if it was someone he idolized, much more impactful than, say, for example, I've got a coworker or a neighbor who I know them, I may even like them, but the influence of their modeling is not as strong as it is for example, my wife, who I love and adore. The impact of her modeled behavior is much stronger, or the impact of behavior being modeled from a parent, a loved parent at least, or an admired supervisor is so much more impactful. So yes, to answer your question, if he idolized it, that's, again, almost, I don't say throwing gas on the fire, but it's really intensifying the impact of the social learning theory going on.
I love what you just said. Do you realize what you've just done, Joe? You have brought in your wonderful R&R lens, and we've infused it with the neurocriminology lens. So hopefully this helps show all of you that both are very important. If we can combine those two, it gives us a much deeper understanding. So we're not telling you to stop doing the good work you're doing, but to complement it. Become friends with the neurocriminology literature.
Level up, as I say. Level up your game. Exactly.
So by all accounts, obviously he had psychopathic traits, but again, the majority of people who have psychopathic traits are not going to commit murder, and especially serial homicide. But if you're not familiar, like psychopathy, psychopathic personality traits, disorders, manipulation is common, pathological lying, the lack of remorse, lack of empathy, higher levels of impulsivity. They can come off as very selfish, more behavioral control problems. So it's really all over the map. If you look at the psychopathy literature in general, not necessarily related to like any kind of murder or serial offending, executive dysfunction is talked about in this literature at times. You want to be aware of the topic of proactive aggression. The topic of alexithymia is actually talked about in the psychopathy literature a little bit. That's another big topic I encourage all of you to learn about, because there's a good likelihood half your clients probably have alexithymia, which is an emotional awareness deficit. It's called emotional blindness, and the client has a very difficult time naming, labeling, making sense of emotions. Emotions can be confusing. People with psychopathy too, again, they could have a longer standing pattern of marital relationship problems, and the list goes on. If we look at deeper in the weeds at psychopathy, there are some studies that have looked at this within the context of like cortisol level abnormalities. Google, if you got time, you want to learn more about psychopathy, Google psychopathy and estrogen or progesterone levels. You'll find it's really fascinating. Looking at some of the prenatal or environmental risk factors that are talked about at times in some of the psychopathy literature, it talks about prenatal stress exposure, attachment problems, childhood abuse issues, having an absent father, deviant peer association. So psychopathy is a big, big topic. Also know that I spoke briefly that Richard Ramirez had a pretty extensive drug and alcohol history. Lots and lots of substances he used, not just a few here and there. But if you consume drugs or alcohol and you have a brain injury, if you already have neurological issues from prenatal trauma, from some of those traumas we spoke about in utero, that in and of itself can increase problematic behavior, impulse control issues, erratic behavior. So we need to figure out how that impacted him as well. So we need to be aware that substance misuse probably played a role in some of his crimes. And again, by no means am I saying if you have a drug and alcohol problem, you're going to commit these issues. But what we know to date now, let's pull it all together so far. He had prenatal trauma. He had a violent alcoholic father. He had 2 head injuries we know about. He had a number of mental health issues. He had extreme poor modeling, lots of trauma from lots of situations. We got drug and alcohol issues on top of that now. We got a lot of things going on with him. As we get deeper into the weeds with him, also take into account what was going on early on in life with him likely contributed to him starting to engage in delinquent behavior. He started to engage as he got a little bit older with just theft, burglary, things of that nature. He stole, he broke into homes, things of that nature. It really started to progress little by little. He did not start engaging in homicide, obviously, right away, but it definitely started to progress. His fantasies, his deviant fantasies started to grow. He was fueled a lot by pornography, violent pornography. Understanding sadistic tendencies is very important. I would encourage your audience to learn about the dark personality. That is going to be involving psychopathy, something called Machiavellian, narcissistic tendencies, sadism, and even moral disengagement. So you want to be aware of the dark personality. And if you ever work with someone that has true sadistic behavior, these are individuals that have pleasure from hurting other people, from seeing other people in pain. On the extreme end, it could involve a serial killer who tortures their victim and they just are aroused by that victim's fear and horror. But you can have people that have everyday sadism. Google the term everyday sadism. It's more common than we realize. These are people that are not necessarily ever going to commit homicide, but these might be people that just have enjoyment making other people's lives miserable, and they just have a lot of fun with seeing other people in pain. A couple studies have actually been conducted on people with everyday sadism, and some of the studies point to the fact that people with everyday sadism tendencies may have more enjoyment in killing bugs. So might be something to think about if you're really screening for early childhood kind of problematic behaviors, maybe digging into histories of, like, do you enjoy killing bugs, or asking the family members, does this person enjoy removing the wings of bugs and torturing bugs and burning bugs and stuff? Things just to be aware of. And we also want to be aware of the fact that he was a Satan worshiper. So again, remember I said before, he claimed and believed he was Satan's right-hand man. There's not a lot of literature on like satanic and devil worshipping ritualistic killings. Just know it represents a very small percentage of homicides, but he engaged in these kinds of behaviors. So if you look at the general satanic and devil worshipping literature within the context of homicide, you want to be aware that in some of these cases, the perpetrator may believe in their mind that they're killing the victim to sacrifice that victim to the devil. You want to look at histories of animal abuse. Unfortunately, there is indication that Richard may have engaged in animal abuse as well. If you look at the general satanic devil worshipping literature too, was there consumption of the victim's blood? These kind of things, removing the body parts of the victim. Richard did engage in some very sadistic behaviors of his victims while they're alive, and even after they died, engaged in removing parts of their bodies at times. So we won't talk much more about that. But one thing I did find interesting is I dug deep into the weeds with his history. There is at least one article that indicated not only was he a chronic drug user, but he had a tendency to maybe have addictive tendencies to eating candy. Why in the world would you want to care about candy eating? Remember some of the talks we've given on excessive sugar consumption. Excessive sugar consumption has been linked to more gut problems, more inflammation in the body, more brain-based problems. His candy eating resulted in tooth decay. Why do you want to care about dental health? Because there's a big connection between what's going on in the mouth, the dental health, our gut, our brain, and our heart. Look at some of that literature. Again, by no means am I saying if someone eats a lot of candy, has bad dental health, there's no connection with serial killing, but these are important target areas that could help improve the health and wellness of your client, because the mouth is the gatekeeper to the gut. It's part of the gut. digestive system. So we want to be aware of that. And if we were to look at the general literature on blood sugar dysregulation, I have no idea if this was going on with Richard Ramirez, but if he had drug and alcohol problems, consuming a lot of candy with lots of sugar, that could throw off blood sugar levels. Why do we care about blood sugar levels? Because if blood sugar levels get too high and then they crash and cause hypoglycemia, that has been linked to more anger control problems, more self-control issues, more irritability. Definitely take a look at some of the podcasts I've done, or even just Google blood sugar dysregulation and problematic behavior. Very, very important stuff to be aware of. He had school problems. He dropped out of school. There's a lot of reasons why people may have school problems, but obviously if kids drop out of school, that's an important target area for intervention. We know from the adverse childhood experiences research that kids that have extensive trauma problems might have more problems in school, and he's had brain injuries and he had prenatal trauma. So we really want to be aware of academic failure. That can be a variable that we also need to take into account. And the other thing I'll mention with him, obviously he clearly had early attachment disruptions. Was that caused by his violent alcoholic father? Partially, probably. Was it caused by his parents being exposed maybe to nuclear radiation? When we study attachment begins in utero. And if someone was exposed to various substances in utero, that can damage parts of the brain that might be responsible for attachment. So if you're bored again and you want to become more neurocriminology informed, take a look at some of the research on oxytocin. Oxytocin is a neurohormone. It's been referred to as the cuddle hormone or the love hormone. Really fascinating topic you'd want to be aware of as well. And if you're in the mental health arena, forensic or criminal justice, it's equally important to understand attachment theory as it is trauma-informed care, because if you can promote positive attachment in the clients you work with, that's been linked with increases in moral reasoning ability. It's been linked with having higher levels of empathy and sensitivity for other people. Greater levels of empathy are a protective factor against problematic behavior. Higher levels of attachment have been linked with greater levels of managing stress. It's been linked with having better school performance, and the list goes on and on and on. So, Joe, I'm going to stop there for a second and again, see if you have any questions, thoughts, comments.
I take notes throughout these interviews, as you know, Jerrod, and you used a term earlier that I jotted down, health and wellness. You mentioned previously that you yourself, amongst your various advanced degrees, have a master's degree in criminal justice. And I think you were noting that when you secured that degree, so many topics that we talked about now weren't covered. I can attest to that as well. I secured my master's degree in criminal justice back in 1988. And when I went to work for the Florida Department of Corrections back then as a probation officer, health and wellness, those terms were not anywhere in the universe of what we did. Not to begrudge the Florida Department of Corrections. In fact, I did a great interview just last week with Joe Winkler, their assistant secretary, and talked all about the amazing, innovative stuff they're doing. But this was 35 years ago when my job was, I interacted with the sheriff's department, the county attorney's office, and the courts, and the public defender's office. Health and wellness stakeholders, that wasn't in our silo. But it's just a testament, I think, to how far the field has come. And it was nice to hear you use that term, health and wellness, which is, as I've been saying, how we need to recalibrate the way we look at those we serve.
Yeah, I believe in my heart, let's say if the prison system moved to the point of serving very healthy, nutritious foods, promoted sleep practices, really became digestive health informed, focused on exercise, yoga, meditation. There are some prisons out there obviously doing that, but there's a lot that aren't. And this is just in the general literature. I think if you promote the health and wellness of offender-based populations, you're actually not only helping them feel better physically, you're helping them feel better emotionally, behaviorally, cognitively. And what impact would that have on recidivism rates? Well, if a client feels better, they're sleeping better, their brain's working better, their body's working better, well, I would sure think they would be in a much better position to find a job and hold a job, make better decisions. If they got some training and education about what it means to eat healthy, I think good things would happen. The same with drug and alcohol treatment programs. I can't count how many cases I've consulted on where someone had a drug or alcohol problem, had all intentions to stay sober, went to the drug and alcohol treatment program, developed a sugar addiction. I see this all the time. It's nothing the program's doing wrong. It's just the way the field is. But a lot of times they go to these inpatient programs and they're served energy-dense, processed food loaded with carbs, loaded with sugars, spikes their blood sugar levels. Blood sugar dysregulation may be a factor that contributes to relapse, and this is supported in the research literature too. So if we have any drug and alcohol treatment programs listening in on this, learning about these things may actually help you develop more of a holistic approach that can help your client achieve longer-term sobriety. So just something to think about.
You mentioned yoga just now. I've got to give a shout out to my dear friend Noel Moran, who's actually been on the show, but has developed a mindfulness-based yoga program, which he designed when he himself was serving a life sentence over in the United Kingdom. Fortunately, he was released after 15 years. He's now a certified yoga instructor and goes back into British prisons to teach the residents of those prisons about mindfulness-based yoga, and the results are just amazing as far as self-harm going down, incidents with COs going down. Another great illustration, though, of how 40 years ago, if somebody would have mentioned yoga, they would have been cast out into that so-called correctional quackery camp. But it's just a great illustration of how we keep needing to level up. I'm going to leave a link. Noel just posted an amazing TED Talk that he did on his experience. And so since I brought it up, I'll leave the link in the description of this episode of Noel's great TED Talk on yoga in prisons.
Yeah, that is so cool that he's doing that. And yeah, the research is really promising. Animal-assisted therapy, gardening therapy, play therapy, music therapy, art therapy, all of these things can be very, very helpful. And not saying not to do your standard COG skills groups, your money management groups, your employment training groups, all very important. But if you were to infuse these other things into it as well, it's a much more holistic approach. So, Joe, I know we're probably running a little bit out of time, but a couple screening things again, just to recap where we're at. But be aware again, prenatal world, what was going on before pregnancy, during pregnancy, after pregnancy. Obviously, understanding potential early health risk factors that could contribute to future problematic behavior. This doesn't always necessarily apply to Richard Ramirez, but if that person was exposed to drugs, alcohol, tobacco, environmental toxins in utero or early on in life, absolutely a factor we want to be aware of. Be aware of lead exposure. Be aware of pollution exposure. Be aware of the adverse childhood experiences research, attachment theory. When we talk about head injuries, be aware of executive function. Be aware of the prefrontal cortex. We've talked about that several times in other podcasts. Be aware of the topic of empathy deficits and moral reasoning deficits and the dark personality. These can be very, very helpful. We want to be aware, too, of different interventions to consider. Anything we can do, again, to promote prenatal health and early childhood development. A lot of it's common sense, but good nutrition, protection from harm, being in a home that's loving, kind, stable, nurturing. These things can all be very, very helpful. Look at some of the literature on parental responsivity. If you are working in like parenting groups, parenting classes, you'd be probably well off to learn about that literature as well. And not only, becoming trauma informed, but becoming attachment informed can be very helpful. And as we recap, if we put our neurocriminology hat back on, in that literature, the research interventions that are talked about, cognitive emotional training is talked about in the literature, mindfulness training, neurofeedback, non-invasive brain stimulation, nutritional interventions, promoting prenatal and maternal care, transcranial direct current stimulation, and again, maybe looking at yoga or exercise, things of that nature. And Joe, as we wrap up, I know we covered a lot of ground, but Richard Ramirez, very complicated case, maybe use this case as a tool to engage other people to talk about all these variables that he dealt with. And again, he dealt with prenatal and childhood trauma, birth defects, poor parental and family modeling, attachment problems, head injury histories. He had an extensive history of drug and alcohol problems. He was exposed to extreme forms of violence at an early age. He had problematic sexual behavioral patterns early on in life. He was a social loner. He had a long-standing pattern of viewing extreme forms of pornography, an extensive juvenile delinquency history, sadistic tendencies, a Satan worshiper, animal abuse history, school problems, and he had a mistrust for people, just to name some of the factors. So I'm just putting this out there. I have no idea what would happen, but let's say someone like him presented early on in life to one of us, and we started noticing all these patterns. Would his life have been different if early intervention was there, if he got lots and lots of support, training, family interventions, nutritional interventions, cognitive skills? I don't know, but it's not going to hurt anything. But early intervention's obviously key. So hopefully this was helpful to all of you. Again, share my email with folks. I know we covered a lot of ground today in a short amount of time. But Joe, do you have any other thoughts, anything else I could go deeper in the weeds with that might be helpful?
Not so much with Richard Ramirez, Jerrod, but we have been talking about the value of being neurocriminology informed. Would you want to give a shout out to your new program on becoming a neurocriminology informed professional?
Yeah, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies just recently launched an on-demand certification program that is a neurocriminology informed professional. It encompasses 14 different trainings. They're 3 hours in length. It's all online, on demand. You can check out our website, but it's really digging deep into the weeds with a lot of these topics. And we're chunking it out very slowly. We're releasing a module at a time. But again, if you're working in any of the helping professions, I think you would do well learning more about this very important and complex field of study.
I myself will be enrolled in this program. So listeners, if nothing else, you will hear me singing the praises of this amazing program and continuing to make those links between neurocriminology and everything we talk about on this podcast. Dr. Jerrod Brown, I'm going to leave links for this program. I'll leave a link for APHIS in general and also for your program at Concordia University around trauma and self-care strategies for the professional.
Joe, thank you. Honored to be back. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day and listening to today's webinar presentation.
All right. Until next time, my friend.
Thank you.
A big Criminologist podcast thank you to Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University and, of course, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. Please check the episode description of this program to discover all of the related links which we referenced in this program. I wanted to circle back to something I said earlier when I was citing the Psychology of Criminal Conduct by Bonton Andrews. It was the portion of the interview when Jerrod asked me and I responded to the influence that his cousin had on him and the fact that he really idolized this individual. And so the principles that I was referencing, I have consulted, of course, my copy of The Psychology of Criminal Conduct, which is never far from my desk. And what it says on that topic is, when we consider behavioral influences, again, against the backdrop of their general personality and cognitive social learning theory, you have to consider, again, those influences, whether they are derived from one of the central 8 variables, such as family marital or work associates or peers, whatever it may be, or even if it is from the practitioner, these same principles apply. They talked about the relationship principle and the structuring principle. Now, the relationship principle says that those interpersonal influences are greatest in situations characterized by open, warm, enthusiastic, and non-blaming communication, and based in collaboration and mutual respect, liking that person, having an interest in that person, or as Jerrod said, he really idolized this individual who was modeling this really horrific behavior, which is what the structuring principle talks all about. The structuring principle says that the pro-criminal versus pro-social direction of the interpersonal influence is determined by the pro-criminal or pro-social content of the message communicated, or by the pro-criminal, pro-social nature of the behaviors that are modeled, rehearsed, and subject to reinforcement and punishment. Something to keep in mind. I am really looking forward to the 7th edition of The Psychology of Criminal Conduct coming out this fall. Stay tuned for that. I don't want to spoil anything, but there's going to be a little surprise with that edition coming out. And of course, I really encourage you folks to look into the new on-demand training that Jerrod has developed with his friends at APHIS, the Neurocriminology Informed Professional Certificate. As noted, I myself have enrolled in this program, so if nothing else, you will learn about this amazing opportunity, as I undoubtedly will be singing its praises as the program unfolds for me. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New, fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this program. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
I love what you just said. Do you realize what you've just done, Joe? You have brought in your wonderful R&R lens, and we've infused it with the neurocriminology lens. So hopefully this helps show all of you that both are very important. If we can combine those two, it gives us a much deeper understanding. So we're not telling you to stop doing the good work you're doing, but to complement it. Become friends with the neurocriminology literature.
We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the podcast or reach
The Criminologist podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.